Where and how you set your location for your novel can make the difference between whether or not your novel works. Today, I want to talk about the setting in your book, in your novel. Um, the the novel that I'm rewriting right now, which is 1991, the setting for it kind of takes place, well, in a certain time, and it takes place in a certain, well, place. And it originates basically in 1991. I think when I mentioned this book before and I was talking about kind of what happened in the evolution of it, is I wrote it basically around the period of 1991. It might have been 92 or 93 when I actually started writing it, and or it might have even been before that. No, actually, it was before that. So basically, it was close to the late 1980s, I think, is when I started actually writing this. So I wrote the first draft of it and then put it into a drawer and left it for for whatever. And so years later, I looked at it and I rewrote it, and I just kept rewriting it because the problem with putting a book in a specific time is if that location that you're talking about changes over time, you might run into problems. And it was written about well, West Germany going into East Germany, and then all across Eastern Europe, then into the former Soviet Union, and all sorts of events that had everything to do with the Soviet Union. Well, when the Soviet Union collapsed and then all of Eastern Europe collapsed, West and East Germany became Germany. And so, like, all sorts of things just kept changing. And then the Russian Federation came, the Russian democracy came, Russian whatever they are today became. And so these things kept changing over and over again. And I kept rewriting the novel over and over again. So what has finally happened is I found a time and period for this book, which is 1991, thus the title 1991. And it explains, or at least that explains when it took place. And so what I then had to do is kind of go back to that period of time and try to remember exactly what was going on in that time in order to make sure that, everything's historically accurate. Because remember, I've been to Europe quite a few different times, and so Europe changed. It's kind of like when I went to South Korea, and then 20 something years later went to South Korea again, and nothing was the same as it was the first time. And so I went expecting all sorts of things to be a different way, and they weren't. And so same kind of thing happens with Europe. And as I've been doing a lot of the research for it and have gone back subsequently to look at different areas, I've realized that not everything is exactly as it used to be, or at least the way it needs to be. So it's kind of caused some problems in the rewriting of this particular novel. Just kind of noticing there's a huge shadow over my face right now. But anyway, so what I then decided to do was to go back into the places and make sure that they're all specifically accurate. And so this novel starts off in the Canary Islands, because that's where the big adventure really kind of starts off. And that's where it did in the original book. And then it kind of branches off into different areas as the hero is tracking down the things that actually happened. Or that happened. Yeah. And so then the historian is basically recapturing all of this information, and researching it as he goes along, trying to figure out, who was here, who was there. Because even in the very beginning, he doesn't even know who the main character of this story is he's following up. He just knows the incident took place, and he's filling in the details as he kind of goes along. And then all sorts of other intrigues. So you've got historical actors that are still on the scene because it's been, decades since it happened, but people are still alive. And so they still affect things as they happen. And some of those people who were kind of bit players before are now very powerful people in government. And so that ends up becoming part of the dynamic as well. And so, like I said, the novel starts off in the Canary Islands, which is a really interesting place. Because when I was there, I was there on a vacation with a friend of mine in the army, and basically he and I went to the Canary Islands and spent a couple of weeks there and had a great time. But I marveled at the idea of the sand dunes and all this kind of stuff that was just totally, you know, exotic to me at the time. And that kind of served as, in my mind, this was going to come back one day to really be something else. And so I kind of went back through that process of trying to figure that out. Now, having since subsequently been there again, in much later years, it's changed a lot. And so I had to kind of go back and try to figure out, you know, what stayed the same, what's not the same, because the historian goes back today, in today's time, and tries to figure out everything that happened way back in 1991. And so I have to kind of make that juxtaposition to show that those kind of things happen. Same thing with Europe. There's going to be all sorts of problems because the government of Europe has changed quite a few times. And the background of where people actually are, that changes a lot. And so I just need to make sure all of that gets captured, where it's pretty easy to talk about how it is today because you can literally go there and look at it. But where things used to be, it's a little more difficult to kind of get those things kind of into the mix. So you're living in the world of it. A good example is there's a television show that was called The Americans. And one of the things that I used to really watch when I was paying attention to all the details of it is, I mean, this takes place in the 1980s, I believe it is. And what I found really fascinating about it is there would be little pieces of technology, and I would pay really, really close attention to like other things in the background to see, did they capture this right? And I remember sitting there, there was one time, it was like a rotary telephone that they were actually using. And it was some other telephone technology or whatever, where I kind of went, they didn't have that yet. And so I remember doing the research on that right after I watched the episode to find out that model had just been in right at that particular period of time. So whoever the person who places items into TV shows did a really, really good job of following up on that. And I was really impressed. And so that's kind of the mindset I've had kind of going into it. So if you're going to, especially if you're going to be writing about a historian, you got to be somewhat historically accurate, and so I've kind of stuck with that. But anyway, I wanted to give you an idea of some of the things that kind of went through this. And I have a kind of a walkthrough of my map. So originally, the novel started off down in, I guess Morocco would be the place. It was in the Canary Islands. Don't have a picture of it on the map right here, but basically somewhere down here. The hero goes through a whole bunch of stuff, and we'll kind of talk about that in a second. But then ends up going back to the United States, then ends up flying to West Germany. So basically area right over in here. And so the story kind of starts off here. So first we go off in, like I said, starts off in the Canary Islands, huge adventure there. Ends up in West Germany. And so remember, there's a West and an East Germany at this time. Former Soviet Republic was over here, and then basically the Eastern Europe, which was still under Soviet domination, or under the Warsaw Pact. And so what happens is he starts off here, and then does a kind of a bunch of undercover kinds of things where he ends up traveling across Germany by train, takes it through basically into East Germany, um, touches off into Poland, and then basically ends up, all the way into the Soviet Union. And so there's a bunch of adventures in this particular area here, Moscow area. And then from there, he actually ends up, and I don't have that on this map either, but ends up in here, place called Angel Island. At least that's the American U.S. translation or English translation of it. There's a little kind of a battle kind of a thing there. And then basically, part of it takes place a little bit off of Siberia, and then ends up with getting rescued somewhere off the coast of Alaska. And so it's literally kind of the map of how the original story went. Well, in the new story, where with the reinterpretation with the historian, we're going to have kind of all of the same places that the original character would have gone through, the original Daniel Thompson character. Basically, his name is now Sheridan. His stuff kind of happens the same way. So that story gets told, but at the same time, we're hearing the historian or watching the historian as he's trying to uncover a lot of the story as well. So a lot of the same places will be in here, although there'll be a couple of little incidents in England that take place because things tied to here to where they get the information from over here. And there's some information I'm still kind of playing around with the idea that I want basically Chernobyl to be kind of involved in the situation as well. And I haven't really figured it out yet, but there's probably another area that I want to kind of bring in. So basically, the historian has to do more of an archaeological approach to kind of some of his research, because I'm assuming you get sent off on wrong tangents from time to time when doing history. So I want to kind of throw that into that and kind of add some other weird kind of little intrigues into it as well. So that's kind of the map that I have for this, just to give you an idea of how it got incorporated in it. Finding an actual map to explain this was kind of difficult. So I found an old historical map. It's basically a historical atlas is what it was, and then found pretty much a map that represents kind of what we're looking at. So it's more like the 1990 version of kind of what the world looked like at this time, or at least Europe. But again, it takes place with pieces of Africa, all through Europe, part of East Asia, and all the way into Eurasia, or Asia itself. And then a couple of little places in the United States. There's also a segment of this map that'll take place where you'll actually see the school where the person's actually the historian at, where he's wow, can't even speak, where the historian's actually working at. And so that's going to be in Michigan. Haven't figured out the name of the school yet, but it's sounding like, something close to, because I went to Western Michigan. And so I'm thinking of something along that line. So like, mid Michigan, or some weird name like that. I'll probably create the name for the university, because I kind of don't want to tie it to an actual university. When I was first doing this novel, when I first wrote it, we got really lucky that we used to have, they were topographical maps that the Army used to have. And so I found a drawer of like unclassified topographical maps of all sorts of areas. So they were totally basically getting rid of them. And so I went through them and I used those to like literally create my map of how they were actually going to get there. And so I had to painstakingly go through and figure out what the roads would have been, because these types of maps didn't actually have roads on them, and then kind of figure that out as we kind of went through. And so And it was a really interesting exercise, and it would actually benefit me greatly years later when I was in South Korea, because I was there at the early 80s, I think it was. And back then we had no actual maps of South Korea, very, very few. And so I basically kind of became a semi cartographer and used that same process that I was doing before to kind of map out a lot of some of the main cities that we were actually in. Because I was doing intelligence work back then, and it, it it was a really interesting exercise to do. And had I not actually done all of that work beforehand in writing this one particular novel, I don't think I ever would have been able to do it, and we would have really been seriously limited in what we were doing back then, because that map that I put together for the areas that we were in really, really helped a lot. And so it's kind of a just interesting how different things kind of pull in and help you in all sorts of different ways. But like I said, I wanted to share the process of how to, find the right places that you're going to be in. Make sure you've got the right places, because I have written novels in the past where I didn't realize that the area that I was actually using as my main focus just wasn't right. Like one area in this novel that I'm doing, and this is a totally new area for me, because historically, when I wrote the first novel, this was not part of the novel, and I didn't know much about it. And that's basically the Crimea. Can never say it right. The Crimea, um, and I needed. It's basically where Gorbachev's island was, and so I had to actually start getting information on this, because that's literally where the new novel starts. And so had to do a lot more research than I ever thought I would have to do. And so I had to do research on it for like how it is right now. And then I had to do research for how it was back in the 1990s. And very interesting approach to do it, especially when we're talking about an area that didn't have a whole lot of information to share, because I'm basically, it's the home of the leader of the Soviet Union, and they didn't offer a whole lot of information out to the general public. So finding that, and basically, I found old newsreels, or not newsreels, but video. They're not video; they're video now. And it was almost like going through microfiche, trying to find, pictures and video of. They don't have microfiche video, but you get the idea, of how a lot of this stuff kind of was, and it was really interesting. Some of it was just in black and white, and I was just trying to have to like interpret those, and kept thinking I could really use Ted Turner right now to colorize this for me. But I mean, those are the kinds of things you do when you're doing research like that, because you want to be accurate. You want to feel like, okay, now my reader knows the reader's really here, because I'm there. And if I can be there, my reader can be there. And so that's kind of what you want when you're writing. Some people write pretty much off the, flying from the seat of their pants, and it shows. And so I'm trying not to do that with this novel. Some of my earlier works might have actually had that kind of a problem, but I'm focusing a lot more on these are real places. I've been to practically every place in this novel to make sure that it actually took place, which sometimes it takes kind of like little diversions here and there, just because I've been there and I thought it was really interesting to incorporate it into the story. But I didn't just include things just because I had been there once before. So anyway, I just thought I'd give you some insight on kind of how you kind of make sure you scout all your areas to know what you're actually writing about, and that way you're accurate and you feel good about the way you're actually writing. So then when you interpret this to your audience, they're sitting there going, yeah, I'm totally with you. And then you can actually tell the story, because remember, it's not just about the scene. You still have to craft a really fun, engaging story, because it's the purpose you're writing in the first place. Or at least it is for me. And hopefully this is helpful.